Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast thematic presentation I'm recording for the part of the lesson that has us looking at primary sources from this unit in Japan. Before we get started, please let me encourage you to open up to today's lesson, scroll down the correct section, and get ready to answer the key concept questions that coincide with each of the primary documents accordingly. Let's go ahead and get started, and please remember that you can play any part of this presentation for detail, clarity, or repetition later on. Section 1. Americans meet sumo wrestlers for the first time. Introduction. The Commodore Perry expedition to Japan of 1853 to 1854 was documented through the narrative of the expedition of American squadron to the China Seas in Japan. This three-volume publication recorded the impressions of the American sailors of what they saw, heard, and learned in Japan. Read the excerpt below about Japanese sumo wrestlers taken from the eyewitness accounts. While contemplating these substantial evidences of Japanese generosity, the attention of all was suddenly riveted upon a body of monstrous fellows who tramped down the beach like so many huge elephants. They were professional wrestlers that formed part of the retinue of the princes who kept them for their private amusement and for public entertainment. There were some 25 in number and were men enormously tall in stature and immense in weight of the flesh. Their scant costume, which was merely a colored cloth about the loins, adorned with fringes and emblazoned with armorial bearings of the prince to whom each belonged, revealed their gigantic proportions in all the bloated fullness of fat and breadth of muscle. Their proprietors, the princes, seemed proud of them, and were careful to show their points to the greatest advantage before astonished countrymen. Some 2 or 3 of these huge monsters were the most famous wrestlers in Japan. Koyanagi, the reputed belly of the capital, was one of them, and paraded himself with the conscious pride of superior immensity and strength. He was especially brought before the Commodore Matthew Perry, that he might examine his massive form. The commissioners insisted that the monstrous fellow should be minutely inspected, and the hardness of his well-rounded muscles should be felt, and that the fatness of his cushioned frame should be tested by the touch. The Commodore accordingly attempted to grasp his immense arm, which he found as solid as it was huge, and then passed his hand over the monstrous neck, which fell in folds of massive flesh, like a dewlap of a prize ox. As some surprise was naturally expressed at the wondrous exhibition of animal development, the monster himself gave a grunt expressive of his flattered vanity. They were all so immense in flesh that they appeared to have lost their distinctive features, and seemed to be only 25 masses of fat. Their eyes were barely visible, the prominence of their noses was lost in the puffiness of bloated cheeks, and their heads were almost set directly on their bodies, with merely folds of flesh where the neck and chin were usually found. Their great size, however, was more owing to the development of the muscle than to the deposition of fat, for although they were evidently well fed, they were not less well exercised, and capable of great feats of strength. As a preliminary exhibition of the power of these men, the princes set them to removing the sacks of rice at a convenient place on the shore for shipping. Each of the sacks weighed not less than 125 pounds, and there were only a couple of the wrestlers who did not carry each 2 sacks at a time. They bore the sacks to the right shoulder, lifting the first from the ground and adjusting it without help, but obtaining aid for the raising of the second. One man carried a sack suspended by his teeth, and another, taking one in his arms, turned repeated somersaults as he held it, and apparently as much at ease as tons of flesh had been only so much gossamer as his load of feather. So let's go ahead and answer these questions right here. What are some of the adjectives you describe the wrestlers, and what effect does the repeated use of these words have on the reader? What is an example of hyperbole by these statements here? Why do you think the Japanese chose sumo wrestlers as an aspect of their culture to show the foreign visitors in 1853? Based on the article's description, which adjective best describes the attitude of the wrestlers? And which statement best summarizes the second paragraph? And what do you think this display had on American visitors? Explain. Here are some answers for you to consider for your own work. Now, although this is open to student opinion, and various answers might in fact vary, the fact that immense, enormous, and monstrous, bloated, gigantic were used in this juncture pretty much saw the effect of painting a picture of massively large men that were intimidating and impressive at the same time. I can only imagine what it must have been like to actually be part of the American fleet looking upon these types of human beings that you can imagine having such great size and magnitude. So hyperbole here would be B. His tons of flesh had only been so much gossamer. Tons of flesh, of course, shows the amounts of weight and fat that these sumo wrestlers might have had. Now, why do you think the Japanese chose sumo wrestlers as an aspect of their culture to show off to the foreign visitors? Well, I think that even though many of you might say or think different things, maybe the fact that the Japanese felt intimidated by the Americans, so to show their sign of strength, this was their way of showing off their own strength and uniqueness at the same time, as sumo wrestlers are not only iconic for the nation, but also I think a symbol of strength and magnitude. Based on the article's description, which adjective best describes the attitude of wrestlers? I would probably say proud. There seems to be a lot of pride here that sumo wrestlers have for the art form and the athletic sport together. Number 5, which statement best summarizes the second paragraph? I would probably say it's letter D here. While the wrestlers were big, they were also very strong. And in this paragraph, they talk about the strength that they had behind their anatomy. What effect do you think this display had on the American visitors? Well, once again, although you might feel free to disagree, I think the fact is that maybe you could note the fact that these men felt intimidated as far as the Americans looking on. They might also be impressed at the same time at the show of strength of the wrestlers. Many men are competitive by nature and might have been feeling above many smaller in stature Japanese that they had met. So this show might have shown them in a different side of Japanese than they had seen prior. In other words, sumo wrestlers probably proved the point to these men that Japanese men and the country as a whole was something to be reckoned with. So there you guys have it. That's the first set of answers to the questions for this first primary doc. Please proceed to the next part of the presentation for the answers to the second part of the primary docs.